what does using Jazz look like? We know that it's a nice layer that makes it easy to sync data and it's nice and secure, but how does that actually translate to me writing apps with it?
So to put it in its most radical way, basically you build a new app, but you throw away your backend and your database. All you do is you start by defining a data model and something that kind of looks like database schemas or like a GraphQL schema. And then as soon as you have that schema, you can start creating objects locally and you can start creating permission structures locally. They're called groups in Jazz. You can like add accounts with different rights, and then you create an object within a group and it inherits the permission rights. That's the mechanics of it. But you can do all of this on the client. Like you can literally create objects in a button on click handler. You can create a group in an invite button on click handler, and it immediately exists locally. You can mutate it synchronously. And that's the only thing you really have to think about. You have this mutable local state that you can start building your app around by basically just building the UI for the features that you want. And then you get accounts and sharing as first class abstractions from Jazz. Again, you just need to build UI around these. And as soon as you combine all of that, you have a fully working multiplayer app that's also offline first. That's how it works most of the time. Some apps might want to interact with existing systems like a traditional database or a third-party API. And what you can do there is use a package called Jazz Node.js, for example, where you have a little server worker that also just becomes a client to the sync and storage infrastructure. And it actually has its own little account, just like users do, and you need to explicitly share data with it for it to be able to either read it or write it, whatever you want it to do. But once you do that, you get this really cool setup where you don't need to make requests to an explicit endpoint anymore. You basically just you talk about the shape of data that exists in your app and the concepts that really make sense for your app. And you've got browser clients or native app clients mutating that state and listening to it. And maybe you have some server workers also listening to it and mutating it. And it all just gets synced without them really knowing about each other explicitly. That's like the coarse picture of the kinds of apps you can build with Jazz and what that would feel like.
In some ways, this reminds me, we were talking to Tomas from Linear about their development process. And because they have a sync engine that drives Linear, a lot of times when a product engineer is coming in and like working on a product, they're really just thinking about like the models on the front end, the shape of this object that you're working with, and not so much thinking about, oh, how does this need to translate into a SQL query or whatever to store this in a database. It's just like really hyper focusing on that. And then sync is taken care of as a matter of course. So this is exciting, but I also think that this layer that you're talking about of, okay, we have to interact with an external service and we need a bridge to bring that external service into our local first world is a part that also I feel like is missed a lot of times in the local first space, because it's like, it's not all just the data that you have at your fingertips, right? It's like all this stuff that's like still out in the real world. So it's cool to hear that you've got a solution for that or thinking about it. Maybe let's build on this conversation. Let's go a little bit deeper and talk about some of the primitives that you have in Jazz. So I was reading through the docs again, and you have this notion of co-values or collaborative values. And there are things like co-map and co-list, and that are data structures that you build your scheme out of. So what other like primitives do you have? Are those the main ones? And when you use these, what does that sort of enable? What is that doing under the hood?
Yeah, so these are really your main contact point with Jazz. And to be precise here, Jazz is actually a framework on top of a protocol called CoJSON, like collaborative JSON. And that's where most of the logic is actually implemented. And CoJSON gives you these different kinds of co-values, like you mentioned, co-map and co-list. These are the two most important ones. You can really think of them as your bread and butter data structures, just like objects and arrays are the most important data structures in JSON itself. And you can represent almost anything with that. And then the way the co-values work together is that the fields in a co-map or the items in a co-list can either be JSON primitives, like a string or a number or a Boolean, or they can be references to other co-values. Internally, they're just represented by storing the ID to the other co-value. But what Jazz does as a framework is it resolves these references for you transparently. So instead of seeing an ID, either loaded or unloaded instance of that other co-value. And finally, Jazz gives you the schemas to precisely define what types the different fields have in your co-maps or co-values. So you can really think of it as co-JSON gives you dynamic JSON where you might have any kind of data, and then Jazz gives you typed schemas on top of that, plus the resolution magic. There are other co-value types. One is called co-streams. We'll probably soon rename it to co-feeds because that makes more sense to people. And that's a map from account to an append-only log of arbitrary items. And that's really useful for something like user presence, because each user on each device just pushes the current state, like cursor position, and then you can really easily get the current cursor position or the history of all cursor positions. Which brings me to another really interesting property of the co-values. By default, they present a view of the current state, like the eventually consistent current state according to your local knowledge. But what they actually are under the hood is the history of all edits that ever happened to them, which means that you can very easily time travel and ask it, what did this value look like 2 hours ago? Or you can go in really detail and see who edited this field at this point in time and see every little edit in there. There are other co-value types. One we already have that is really important is binary co-streams. They're just co-streams that you store chunks of binary data in, but what that lets you do is store files or even video streams in Jazz itself. So now you don't even need blob storage anymore. They get synced just like all of your structured data, and you can reference images or any kind of binary file like a PDF directly from your co-values. And again, something that is for some reason traditionally very hard, like file uploads or image uploads, is suddenly super easy and just another thing you can play with. Really important co-value types that are still coming are co-plain text and co-rich text, where co-plain text is basically just a co-list of characters, and that's how you represent collaborative plain text with like concurrent insertions of people working the way you would expect. And then co-rich text is a particularly interesting one, because even with CRDTs, if you implement rich text in a kind of naive way where you represent a DOM tree, you can end up in really hairy situations and really crazy conflicts where even the automatic conflict resolution of the CRDT does end up with a like eventually consistent state, but it's nowhere near what you would expect semantically. And you have all of these little pieces of duplicated text and broken formatting. The way code will represent rich text is where you have the plain text as a list of characters. And then you have what is called markup ranges that point to like movable positions in the CRDT, where the intent is captured by default in a much more high fidelity way. And the conflict resolution does exactly what you would expect, even in quite complex scenarios, which I think is really important for every app that needs rich text, which is actually like a lot of collaborative apps. And that's probably going to be all of the co-value types ever. You can do a lot with those. And building your app is really just like, how do you combine the different co-values into a shape that represents the data of your app? And what is the permission structure of groups that each of the co-values needs to be in to represent how sharing and permissions work in your app?
Yeah, so that's one thing that stands out a lot to me is when you create these co-values, you just say, this is just for me, this is for this group. I feel like that's super cool. Is there any other stuff that you do at the declaration site of a co-value that is like a unique feature like that?
I don't think so, and that's all you need. What's the shape of it? Who owns it? One thing we want to try in the future maybe, but I can't really promise that, is to pull some of the permission structure more into the schema itself. Because right now it's like when you create a co-value, you say which group it belongs to, for example. But even that's pretty ergonomic. And because the groups and who are members of it are like a very dynamic thing, you typically want to use that in the parts of your UI where you implement like a sharing flow, for example.
You said that the whole backend is encrypted, which is another super cool property of it. But does that make debugging harder? If you have a user that's having some trouble and you want to go look at a table or something just to see what the state is, can you just not do that in a Jazz app?
By default, no, but what you can do, we have something called a Jazz inspector. Like if the user trusts you with their account credentials, you can just look at data as them and you have access to everything as they do. And that's what you use for debugging. It just makes that initial step of them having to give you their account credentials a bit more explicit. And probably will offer a default way of doing that where if, and to be precise here, I mentioned earlier that like You can build traditional apps that are end-to-end encrypted in the sense that my sync server doesn't see your data, but you can, of course, also use Jazz in a way where it's fully end-to-end encrypted and you can't see your user's data, like you just mentioned. So I think in our kind of like cloud/developer dashboard that we're working on, we'll probably have that as an option where you're like, look, I'm a trusted app. My users trust me. From some auth methods, like if you use Clerk or something like Auth0, the way it works is that the Jazz credentials, like the key pair, is literally stored in the metadata of the user. So by default, admins already have access to that anyways. And then that way, if your users already trust you, you might as well give the developers the full debugging experience of being able to look into every individual user. But it's no longer a default. It's no longer something that's the only possible thing. You can build end-to-end encrypted apps, and then it's harder to debug. But with individual users, you might just ask them for their account credentials.